Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks again for tuning in for our weekly webinar coming to you from the Smith School of Business, where we look at business issues in the time of coronavirus. Today, we're talking about decision making, something that can be particularly hard to do under stressful circumstances. This webinar is presented by Smith Business Insight and by Queen's Executive Education. My name is Meredith Dalt, and I'm a business journalist at the Smith School of Business, which is at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario. Before I introduce today's speaker, as I do every week, I want to remind you that this discussion will be recorded. You will be receiving a recording in your inbox sometime soon, probably tomorrow. So those of you looking to have the slides, you will definitely be getting those, but you'll be getting the whole presentation in your inbox. If you want to ask a question, and we very much hope that you will, please use the Q&A button that you'll see at the bottom of your screen. I will monitor those questions, and then we'll work through the questions as time allows for the last section of the webinar today. It's now my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Professor Salman Mufti. Professor Mufti is an associate professor of management information systems at Smith School of Business. He specializes in strategic decision-making and in digital transformation, and he is the recipient of several MBA Teaching Excellence Awards. Professor Mufti has served as Associate Dean of Queen's Executive Education and has extensive experience in executive education at Smith School of Business in Canada and with Cornell University's Johnson School of Management in the US and with the IEDC Bled School of Management in Slovenia and Skolkovo Moscow School of Management in Russia. How did I do? Pretty well, those names. Before joining Smith in 1997, he spent 12 years as a manager and consultant working with organizations in the private and public sectors. He continues to advise senior managers in companies and government, and he is a regular speaker on corporate conferences and executive education programs. Thank you very much for joining us today, Salman.
Thank you very much, Meredith, and welcome everybody to the webinar. Thank you so much for taking the time to attend this webinar, and I'm looking forward to spending some time with you to talk about decision making. What I'd like to do is first of all say that I hope everybody is keeping safe and healthy in these challenging times. And thought I'd share with you what I've learned about decision making and what I'm seeing regarding decision making challenges in these times. Now, what I'd like to do is get you to imagine a little bit a situation. And the situation I want you to imagine is this. Imagine that there is a global crisis taking place, and that it is unfolding, it is very long, and is causing all kinds of economic issues. Your organization's revenues are down by 50%. Your competitors are scrambling. The government is promising some relief, but you're not sure if it's going to apply to your company. The situation is really bad because you have no idea how long this is going to go on. And now you have some decisions to make. Should you look inside the organization and try and figure out how to cut costs, perhaps even look at layoffs, look at what the competitors are doing in terms of perhaps protecting their revenue or looking at other ways of trimming down. Maybe look outside your industry into other organizations and see how they're pivoting to find new sources of revenue. And to top it all off, you've got only a few days to make this decision. And as you can see, that this is not something that we're imagining. You're actually living this. Many of you are facing this firsthand, and others are involved in organizations or with organizations that are going through this. So I started talking to a number of managers and executives to try and find out what's going on here and how are they thinking. So what I'd like to do is share with you some thoughts around this. Really, a couple of things have come up. One is that the process of making a decision is important to them. They're asking what method, what steps should I think about when I'm making a decision? And the second thing that they told me is that they're worried about guidelines, or they're asking what sort of guidelines should they use to make these decisions. And what's really interesting is that they're quite clear about the guidelines. Things like safety of the employees and their customers is top of mind. Certainly the idea about honesty and integrity is very clear, and transparency. What they're not clear about, perhaps, is what process should they use to make decisions here. And what I'd like to do is try and address this in this webinar. So let me go to my slides here. And as Meredith mentioned, we will have a copy of these slides to you after the presentation. And I'd like to start off with a slide called the decision-making problem, with a quote. And the quote I have here is that for every complex problem, there is an answer that is simple, neat, and wrong. And the reason I find this quote interesting and applicable is that unlike, say, the sciences, where usually there is an answer that is simple and neat and correct. So think of mathematics or physics. Management and business is a bit more complex, a bit more uncertain. And often a very simple answer does not address the problem. So the issue and the challenge really here is to think of a process that would help us come up with a solution that addresses that complex problem. Now, how are managers advised to make decisions? Well, the expectation is that managers will use a logical step-by-step process to come up with decisions. There are many different methodologies out there, but often most of these methodologies would have these 6 steps. The first one is to define the problem. Next is to identify the decision criteria, allocate weights to the criteria, develop a number of alternatives, and then evaluate each alternative against the criteria and try and select the best possible one. So this is what we call the rational decision-making model. And this is what we teach, what we expect people to use, especially managers, when they're trying to solve complex problems. But I think the question really is, how do managers actually make decisions? And this is a question that has intrigued me for many, many years. And the way I've tried to address this question is not just asking managers how they make a decision, but try and observe them while they're actually making decisions in a naturalistic setting. And what I see is something a bit different. I see something like this. A big meeting is over and 2 guys are having a sidebar. In fact, one is whispering to the other and saying that, you know, we did a Pareto analysis, we did a grid analysis, a decision tree, even something called a force field analysis. And then the boss decided to go with his gut. Now, I'm sure many of you have experienced something like this. And you wonder what's going on, because looks like we did a lot of due diligence here. And even after making a recommendation based on these extensive analyses, the boss decided to go with something different. And that's the reason one is whispering to the other. Now, a number of dysfunctionalities can occur in the organization. Things like we try to provide the boss with the type of information we think that is going to help make that decision that he or she has already made. Or perhaps we think that this whole process is really there for more optical reasons and for buy-in reasons rather than actually making a good decision. But perhaps there's something more going on in here. Now, what I wanted to illustrate right off the bat is that even making decisions in good times, in stable times, is difficult. And it seems that the process is not very clear to us in terms of how people actually make a decision. Now, layer on top of this a changing environment, and making decisions in more uncertain or bad times becomes even more challenging. Let me give you a sense of the different types of environments that we face. Now, there is one sort of environment which is very stable. It happens once in a while where things are quite stable, and we can pretty much see the future. We can forecast how things are going to change. So we can actually plan based on the information that we're getting from the environment today. But then many of us have experienced environments where there really isn't a clear enough future. There are many other players involved in the environment, and whatever plan or decision we make may be countered by other players in the market, and therefore we will have to adjust along the way. So we have to think not just of our immediate decision, but think of subsequent decisions that we will need to make. So think of yourself as a chess player that you have to think a few moves ahead. But then, of course, the environment becomes even more uncertain. A new technology comes out, a new market opens up, and suddenly there is a range of possible outcomes. It's not as discrete anymore. And then, of course, you may have a situation where total ambiguity exists. Really, there is no precedence for it, and we have no idea which way this is going to go. And my sense is that the environment that we find ourselves in right now is somewhere over here. And that is sort of what I would call the COVID-19 environment. It's uncertain. We're not really sure how long this is going to go on. It's in many ways unprecedented. It's widespread. And there are all kinds of possible outcomes that we want to consider. So what should we do? Well, these kinds of situations are often referred to as crisis situations. And in crisis situations, there are some very interesting things that make decision-making even more difficult. A crisis usually is defined as something that is unexpected and creates uncertainty. And it's often a threat to your business goals, to your important goals. Now, which means there is a lack of reliable information. And the information that may be available may actually be quite conflicting. There's also lack of relevant experience, because if it's unprecedented, it means that we haven't seen it before, and then we may have little or no control over the situation. The consequences can be more serious. The impact or the outcome can have far-reaching consequences, and some of them may be irreversible. And there is less time, a lot less time, to make a decision. Now, under such stress, there is a tendency for us to revert to more of a basic fight or flight reasoning. Either we're not going to do anything or run away from it, or we're going to throw everything at it and try and fix the situation right away as fast as possible. So this is what I think a number of managers, many of you, are facing as a situation, is that do we do nothing and just hope that this thing passes? Do we do something, or do we do everything? Now, maybe this is a good time to take a deep breath and just take a step back and ask ourselves, what have we learned about decision-making from years of experience and research? And see if we can use that learning into today's world. So what I thought I'd do is I'd share with you just a little bit of theory. If we quickly review what we have learned from decision-making research, we've learned that classical ways of making decisions assumes that people are rational, that they make complete calculations to reach optimum decisions. But observing people in action, researchers have found that in real life, people don't actually look at everything, and people don't come up with the best possible solution. They actually look at a few things, and they try to come up with a solution or an answer that is good enough or slightly better than good enough. Think of buying a car. If in the recent past you bought a car, chances are you didn't look at every car in the world. You probably looked at a subset of cars. And then not only that, you picked a car, you bought a car that was not the best possible one in that subset. It was one that was good enough or slightly better than good enough. Why? Because it was not available. It was, you couldn't afford it, or perhaps it was not practical. So you made some sort of a compromise. In fact, what researchers have found that even though it's not the best possible solution you come up with, you actually learn to like that solution. You learn to love that car and make the most of it. The other thing we thought that if we had the luxury of having all the information, maybe we will come up with the best possible solution. The researchers have found that that's not even true. Even if we have all the information, the way we perceive the situation has a big bearing on how we come up with a decision. For example, if something is presented to you as an opportunity, you tend to become risk averse. So if you have a new technology like blockchain or artificial intelligence, and people are saying this is going to be a huge opportunity for your industry, you might react to it a little differently if it's proposed to you as an opportunity. If the same technology is proposed as a threat, you might actually become risk-taking. So how we frame a problem actually has a very big impact on how we think about it. Often, as I said, if something is an opportunity, we become risk-taking, risk-averse, and if it's as a threat, we become risk-taking. So this raises a fundamental question, and that should we trust our gut instinct or should we do rigorous analyses? And like everything else in management and business, we know that the answer is often not on the extremes, it's somewhere in the middle. But let's take a minute and look at these extremes here. Well, there are two fundamental ways of making decisions. One is what we call system one thinking or intuition. This is very fast. It happens in a couple of seconds or less. It's very automatic, very instinctive, and often emotion plays a role. Now, it's not magic. It probably relies on mental shortcuts that you have developed over years and years of experience, and you very quickly come up to some sort of a conclusion when you look at a problem. On the other extreme, we have something called analysis. We also call it system two thinking. It is often very slow, logical, effortful, and very deliberate. It actually follows rules. If it's numbers, you do calculations. If it's not numbers, you do categorizations. And you use some sort of a framework or a tool or a model to try and make sense of it. Now, there are advantages and disadvantages with each of these. Well, if we look at analysis, system two, the advantage is that it is a logical, systematic process, and it helps you uncover cues and patterns when you have lots of data. And if you have a number of alternatives, you can actually evaluate those alternatives against the criteria. But the problem with analysis is, and many of you probably have experienced this, is that there's a tendency of doing over-analysis. The fear of making the wrong decision can lead to what we call analysis paralysis. And often, we revert to the status quo or we delay the decision too long. There are advantages and disadvantages associated with intuition as well. One way to think about this is that intuition is non-conscious thinking. It's based on lots of experience and knowledge and expertise you have developed over the years. And it seems in today's world, intuition is critical as we have little time to absorb and weigh all the information and making a decision. In fact, we hear, even in the best of times, that there's just simply too much information coming at me to make a decision. Intuition also helps you make a decision a lot faster. Even if the information is good, it has a shelf life. And you want to take advantage of that opportunity and make a decision very quickly. We hear that from entrepreneurs a lot, is that the opportunity may go away, so I have to act on it very quickly. The problem with intuition, however, the big disadvantage is that if you overuse it, you become susceptible to psychological and behavioral flaws. Things like you often give a lot more weight to the very first piece of information that you receive. or unconsciously you try to look for information that supports the intuition that you've already had. So here's the challenge. On one hand, we have analysis. On the other hand, we have intuition. People say that analysis is good, and I agree. But then too much analysis is not good. Intuition, on the other hand, is something that we also just have naturally if we have lots of experience. And it can really serve us well when we have a situation that we've seen before and we don't have a lot of time. On the other hand, we know that relying on intuition can get us into trouble all the time. So this is what I faced a few years ago. And I thought, how do I make sense of this? Is there some sort of a way that I can find that actually blends these two things into a more effective way of making decisions? So this is what I observed. I looked at a number of executives and managers in making decisions, really important decisions. And this is what I found that they did. They had some sort of a problem that they wanted to solve. And they said that instead of doing analyses right away, which is rather unnatural, they very quickly came up with some sort of an intuition. And because they said that the analysis approach was not very natural to them. But they didn't turn their intuition into a decision because they knew that if they did that, they might be, as I said, susceptible to psychological and behavioral flaws here, traps that they could fall into. So what did all these successful managers and executives do when faced with an important decision? Let me show you what they did. They all did the same thing. They all went this way, then this way, and then this way. And then after reviewing this and looking at this, it dawned upon me that this is something quite amazing. I'd like to say that this is the most powerful framework ever devised by humankind. And I'm not saying it because I came up with it, but this is, loosely speaking, is what we call the scientific method. When a scientist observes a phenomenon, he or she does not come up with a theory. He or she comes up with a hypothesis. The intuition is simply your hypothesis. But a good scientist does not force their hypothesis into theory. They collect data, run experiments, and try to reject or accept their hypothesis. And what I found is that successful decision makers actually used a scientific method. The intuition was simply their hypothesis, and then they conducted rigorous analysis to see if they can reject their hypothesis. And if they couldn't, they said, well, this is my decision. And I suspect this is what that manager was doing in the cartoon that I showed you earlier in terms of trying to make sense of the situation. Now, when it comes to analysis, you may want to look at information, especially if it's available and you have the time to try and analyze it. You may want to talk to people and experts and get their opinion and ideas on the solution that you should come up with. And of course, you should look at the guidelines that you may want to follow, what I'd like to call values. And I mentioned values like safety and integrity and transparency. So fundamentally what this is system one, which is intuition, followed by system two, which is analysis. Now, the difference here in a crisis situation or an uncertain situation that is fast changing, one of the things that you may want to consider is to try and time box this, because you don't have the luxury of all the time that you have. So what you want to do is put some sort of a time limit around it. One way that I see very good decision makers make decisions in crisis situations is that they ask themselves, how much time do I have right off the bat? And then use up all the time to make that decision following a process like this. So what I'd like to do is show you a framework that I've developed based on this idea. I call it the ACE framework. Whenever you have a situation, whether it's a stable environment or an uncertain environment like today, ask yourself, what is the problem? And then ask yourself, what's your intuition? And the reason I think this is important is because you're going to have an intuitive decision right away. So might as well surface it and see what that is. But then resist the urge to turn that into a decision and ask yourself, what are the alternatives? And the way you do that, as I said, is look at information, talk to people, and look also at your own values. In fact, your intuition simply is one of those alternatives. Next, ask yourself, what are the criteria? How should I consider this particular alternative? And of course, criteria like cost and reputation and revenue and safety and other things are always included. Evaluate each alternative against each criterion and then come up with your decision. In some cases, the decision will be the same as the intuition that you had, but from my observation and experience, I find that in most cases, the decision is different than the initial intuition that you had. So this is a framework that you can put in your back pocket and use it all the time. I'm quite confident about this framework, not only in good times, but also I've seen people pretty much follow this particular approach when their situation is a bit turbulent. So let me also then share with you a checklist here that goes a little bit more deeper into this framework. And when you are faced with the situation, you may want to consider that checklist to make decisions. So when you are facing a situation, a problem, ask yourself, is this a people strategy or a crisis decision? And the reason asking this question right up front is important is that it will give you a sense of the timeline that you have. If it's a people decision, you may have a bit more time. If it's a strategy decision in a stable environment, you have a lot more time. But if it's a crisis decision, then you have very little time. But you still need to ask yourself, how much time do I have to make a decision? You also want to ask, what is the cost of not making a decision, especially in a crisis situation? Because usually status quo, not doing anything, is not a good option. Then, as I said, ask yourself, what is your intuition? What is your hypothesis? Ask yourself, what is your intuitive sort of thinking right away? What do you think that I'd like to do? Ask yourself, what is the biggest fear you have for making the wrong decision? And if that turns out, can you actually live with that particular decision? And as I said, again, I'd like to reiterate, what is the cost of not making a decision? Think of your intuition as your first alternative, and then try and generate another 2 to 4, so a total of 3 to 5 viable alternatives. Often we come up with 3 alternatives: do nothing, do something, and do everything. But it's always a good idea to ask yourself, what else could we do? Because doing nothing is not a good idea, and doing everything may be impossible. So look for other alternatives. And then ask, would it be worth the time and cost to search for more? Because again, given the time that you might have, it may be impossible to spend more time to look for more alternatives. And often looking for other alternatives, there's a cost associated with it. So there's a diminishing return that kicks in. And so you may want to say, okay, I've had enough alternatives, let's go with that. Then ask what criteria that you should consider. Come up with 2 or 3. And the reason I'm recommending 2 or 3 is because coming up with 6 or 7 criteria will really bog you down in the decision-making process. Certainly, all the criteria are important, but pick the 2 or 3 most critical ones, the overriding criteria. These are the main ones, the make or break ones. And then ask yourself about the values again. Have we included the impact of the situation on our people and the organization? I think it's always a good idea to do a double check on it to see if we are addressing that. And then do an evaluation. Look at each alternative against each criterion. You may want to use some sort of a simple table and try and rank each alternative against the criterion. You may want to have a discussion, a very informal discussion. So there are all different kinds of ways of going through this. Perhaps the most important question you may want to consider is that what is the biggest downside of each alternative? Each alternative is going to have something negative associated with it. And so you want to go through that and make sure that you surface that disadvantage that each alternative is providing. And once you've gone through this exercise and you're coming to the end of the time that you have set for yourself or has been imposed upon you, make a decision. And ask, am I more or less confident about this final decision versus my intuitive decision here? And as I said, in some cases, it will be the same as the intuitive decision that you had. But from my experience and observation, I would say that in most cases, it will be different. It will be better. The bottom line then is that a good decision is the one that creates more benefits than the alternatives and has fewer or less severe downsides. Really, in the end of the day, there's no such thing as a perfect decision. Given the time that you had, given the information that was available and the people that you could speak with, you try to make the most informed decision as possible. So there's no reason to beat yourself up if you think that you could have had more information or you could have done more analysis. The key here is that you have used a process and you've done your best possible in trying to make that decision. This is much better than a knee-jerk decision or getting all paralyzed with too much analysis. So in conclusion, what I'd like to do is give you some advice on making decisions in a crisis, and then we'll have time for some questions and answers. I'm proposing that regardless of the times we're in, start with your intuition. It's very natural. You're going to have it anyways. So look at it. But then take all the time that you have to analyze the information and discuss the solution with experts. Use this sort of scientific method. Use that ACE framework that I was mentioning. Number 2 is take a hard look at your organization and the organization's values. Ask yourself, are you taking these values into account? When I talked to a number of executives and managers over the last couple of weeks, I not only heard values like safety, integrity, and transparency, but also the issue of cost and revenue, the traditional values as well, especially as they're going forward. They were talking about that while these metrics like revenue and cost and so on matter, but right now they'll have to take a back seat to other sort of important and immediate things. And finally, the answer to the problem may not be simple, but the process of decision-making doesn't have to be complicated. As long as you have a good tested process in place and you follow it, you are going to maximize the likelihood of coming up with a good solution. So with this concludes that's sort of the formal part of my presentation. I'll hand it back to Meredith here, who will facilitate the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Salman. That was fascinating and so useful. We do have some questions, and I would encourage the audience to feel free to ask questions now at this point. You can just slot those into the Q&A button at the bottom, using the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. First question, what if intuition and data are conflicting? Also, it's hard to convince a board or a panel of your intuition, specifically if you have multiple decision makers. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a very good question. And you're right. Often the data that are presented will conflict with your intuition. And thus, I think you should think of your intuition simply as your first alternative, as your initial decision, and not try and turn that into the final decision. The conflicting data will help you come up with other alternatives. And I think what you can do then, if you can present and reframe intuition as an alternative, it will go a long way in trying to present this as the decision-making process. If you have multiple decision makers out there, let's say in a board, that's a bigger problem, because in any decision-making process, you have to ask yourself, who has the D? Who is the ultimate decision maker? Because if you have many decision makers, then you're going to get bogged down in analysis paralysis again here. So the best I could offer to you is do not become emotionally attached to your intuition. Look at it with cold eyes, the process here, and test it with the data that is available to you.
Excellent, thank you. Somebody asks, do you have a favorite framework or two that we can study and apply to the analysis piece? What is respected in most management circles?
Yeah, that's also a very good question. There are many, many frameworks and models out there. And some of them are very complicated, require a lot of data. So think of a decision tree where you have to have probabilities, you have to have expected values, and you go through that. I think complicated frameworks are good for tactical and operational decisions. But if you're making strategic and crisis decisions, you want to come up with a simple model. And my favorite model is what I call, is what's called a decision table. You put alternatives, say, on rows and the criteria in the columns. And as I mentioned, do not have more than five alternatives, so sort of 3 to 5 alternatives, and about 2 to 3 criteria, and then just rank them. Now, the table will give you some sort of an answer that which alternative is the best, but don't just accept it as that. Use that decision table as a basis for debate with the decision makers, and have a good spirited debate, and you'll find that that will be very helpful. One of the quotes that I always use in class is that great teams have good fights. So you want to actually use that model as a way of starting a discussion as opposed to ending the decision-making process.
Interesting, thank you. This question, the question's very brief. Wouldn't criteria be better before alternatives when it comes to efficiency?
So I've been challenged on this quite a bit. Is that in my ACE framework, I mention the alternatives before the criteria. So alternatives, criteria, evaluation is sort of the steps I mentioned. And the reason I think that is important to keep it that way is that it's more natural for people to come up with alternatives first. People don't come up with criteria first. Just whenever we have a problem, we often think of solutions right away. It's just a very natural thing to do. And the second reason, which I think is even more important to put alternatives before criteria, is that I've decided to call this framework the ACE framework. And if I put C before A, it just would not work. No, I'm just joking. The reason I think it's important this way is that if you come up with criteria first, you might constrain the more creative alternatives. You might do a superficial analysis and say, well, it doesn't fit what we're thinking. And you may not give it sort of enough sort of a look. So I think it's more natural that way. And I think it will allow you to be more innovative, creative, more imaginative in coming up with the alternatives.
All right, well put, thank you. How about this? How do we handle a situation where the optimal decision or action has a higher cost versus a good enough decision with a lesser cost? I think that's the question. How do we handle a situation when the optimal decision slash action has a higher cost versus a good enough decision have a lesser cost? With a lesser cost.
So the way I understand it is that, the more sophisticated a decision that you might come up with that addresses all the criteria in the best possible way will have a much higher cost associated with it. And that happens in many organizations. The issue here is that you might come up with a perfect decision, but then it becomes more difficult to implement it because of all the nuances that are associated with something that is that optimal or that perfect. What I have found is that most executives would actually come up with a suboptimal decision, but not compromise on the implementation of that decision, on the execution of it. Because I think they realize that if they go for perfection, the problem will come when they try to actually execute that particular decision. It would just be too costly, it will take too much time, and there will be too many complications associated with it. So my recommendation is, don't let, as they say, the great be the enemy of the good here. Don't let, sort of perfection get in the way here, and go with something that is good enough or better than good enough, because the implementation would be much more successful.
All right, well put. I've read and heard that most people make decisions based on emotions and then later on justify it using reasons. Can you say if this is an invalid assertion?
I think it's a very valid assertion. Most of us unconsciously come up with an intuition and then unconsciously look for information to try and validate that. And it's not a knock on us. That's just the way we are as human beings, is we like to confirm evidence, as we call it in the decision-making world here. And thus, I think it's extremely important when you're making a big decision, say as a strategy decision or a crisis decision, is not to do it alone. Do it in a team, do it with other people, because then those other people will challenge your intuition and will also provide you with information that goes against what you think you're doing here. So I think to have a team-based approach, even if it's a small team, 3 or 4 people, is better than just doing it alone, because then you risk, as you said, confirming your intuition rather than challenging it.
Right. Which, this person asks a similar question. Wouldn't intuition bias your analysis to confirming the intuition rather than challenging it?
Yeah.
So similar.
It's a similar one. And I think the key here is not only do it in the team, but make sure the team is diverse. Make sure the team has different perspectives and make it as diverse as possible. And I realize that having a 4 or 5 person team, you cannot make it fully diverse in an organization, but even a little bit of diversity and independence will go a long way in helping you make that decision. I always refer to in my class to the jury system. And, you might have jurors who are not experts in that particular situation, but when provided with evidence and when they have a good debate amongst themselves, they often come up with a good decision here. So you don't even have to have all of the people in your team as experts. As long as you have diversity and independence of opinion, you are going to increase the likelihood of them challenging each other.
Well, interestingly then, the next question that's come in, what about then when you end up in a group situation and people's, hearing different people's intuitions will lead to a desire for those people to win versus find the best decision? Like having their idea be the one that wins, even if it's not evidence supported, say.
Yeah. And again, it's a very natural thing. We're emotionally attached often to our intuition. But if we reframe, as I said, our intuition as a hypothesis, if you do that, you allow yourself to be wrong. Because that's what a hypothesis is something that is to be tested. But if you frame it as something that is your, this is your decision, then you're going to become wedded to it. We know that even if you're an expert in your field, and you probably are, many of you are, we know that experts can be wrong. And so therefore, it really becomes important if you are an expert, especially in that situation, for you to challenge yourself and have others challenge you. And as I said, great teams have good fights, and I think that is a much better approach than everybody trying to win in this particular situation.
Mm-hmm. Can you comment on how to apply values-driven leadership frameworks in decision-making during crisis, especially when there are multiple decision makers?
Yeah, the idea of values, as I mentioned, is that you can sort of put them in a couple of buckets. One is sort of the traditional values that you have, like revenue and cost and reputation, or you can put them in more sort of the social and people-oriented stuff here, and things like, as I mentioned, like health and safety and transparency and trust and things like that. I think one of the things you may want to do is look at the organization's values. Often many organizations not only would have a mission and a vision and objectives in their strategy, but they will list some values there. And I think you have to have a look at those values and ask yourselves, are you actually using these values in the decision process, or are you coming up with your sort of own ones? And secondly, are you comfortable with those values at this moment here? So I think that's the best way to bring it in, is to look at the values that you developed in stable times and see if they apply in a crisis environment.
Well, then how about this question? How do you contend with low quality data? So you're trying to make decisions with an incomplete picture or with assumptions because you're trying to do it with low quality data, and which we're all doing in these uncertain times.
Yeah.
How do you contend with that?
Even in the best of times, you're not going to have access to all the data. And even if you do, the theories that I mentioned to you is that we don't often look at everything. In a crisis situation, you're going to even have less data, as I mentioned, and a lot of the data are going to be conflicting. I'm reminded of something called the Powell 40-70 rule. You may remember many years ago, there was a Secretary of State in the United States, Colin Powell. I believe it was under George W. Bush's regime. And he came up with something called the 40-70 rule. And he said, in his experience as a general, as a politician, he found that he had to look for information. If he found that the information was between 40% and 70%, it was good enough to make a decision. If it was less than 40%, he was worried, and he went and looked for more. And he said it was rare, very rare, that he had more than 70% information available to him. So think of that. If you have about 2/3 of the information available to you, I think you've got enough here. The other thing is that once you implement a decision, there's the opportunity to correct that if it's not working out. So set your ego aside and say, well, it's not working out, and we're going to change it. So one of the things I'm also seeing is that in decisions where there's not a lot of information available, the implementation is done in phases and not all at once. And we're seeing that in today's world. You're seeing companies and even governments announce changes or decisions that are being implemented in phases, is because they're trying to see, what happens and use that additional information and experience they have to refine their decision here. So you may want to think of the 40-70 rule.
Okay, very helpful. This question is about how you hire someone when you're hiring for a leader who's going to have good decision-making abilities. So any advice in recruiting decision-making skills for a leader? Styles of questions.
Well, certainly nowadays we're seeing in the interview process not only about looking at your background, but also doing behavioral interviews. I think one of the things you may want to do is give that person a problem to solve and have them not only solve it on paper or on the computer, but have them think aloud as they're going through solving that problem, because that will give you an idea of the process that they're using to make that particular decision. There is no other way of finding out that people use. But I would suspect that if they have some sort of a structured and disciplined process that they use, that gives you an idea that they're not just coming up with a decision and pulling it out of the air. They're actually using some way of developing different alternatives and coming up with the decision. The higher up you go in the organization, the more alternatives you often come up with. So if you're hiring somebody for a senior role, see if they are solving problems with coming up with multiple options, as opposed to simply jumping to the conclusion right away. So I hope that helps.
That does. I'm sure it helps. We have so many questions. Fortunately, we have probably 5 more minutes, so I'll keep winging them out at you. You're doing a great job.
Yeah, happy to.
What if the ultimate decision-making gets wrapped up in analysis by paralysis or needs more information?
So putting a time box, boxing it in some sort of a timeline, I think is important because otherwise we can go on forever. Analysis paralysis, I think, often happens when somebody doesn't like the way the decision is going. And they say, well, let's get some more information. Let's do some more analysis here. So I think at that point, what you need to sort of think about is how much consensus do you need to say that this is a decision here? We live in Canada, we work in Canada, most of us, and we like 100% consensus in this country, which I think is a great and a noble thing to aspire for. But in most situations, especially crisis situations, we're not going to have the opportunity to have 100% consensus. So I like to sort of think that having sufficient consensus is good. Now, I don't know what that number is. I think it's between 51% and 100%. But you have to sort of say to yourself, have I heard enough? Have I seen enough? Have I thought enough? And then ask others, I realize that you don't like this particular decision that we're coming up with, but can you live with it? And if they said, okay, yeah, this is something I can live with, then you go ahead with it. Now, of course, if people cannot live with it, you have to take up all the time that you have. But at some point you say that you've done all the due diligence, and if it's enough, and I'll make the decision and I'll be accountable for that particular decision.
Okay, thanks. In the current situation, we may need to reevaluate decisions many times as the situation unfolds. How does the need for iterative decision-making work in the model? And when do you know when to implement rather than wait when the cost of waiting is unclear?
Yeah. So a very thoughtful question. And by the way, I'm not going to repeat that word that you said there.
Iterative. I can do it now.
Great. I've been studying decision-making for a little while in managers and executives. And my sense was that, some lean more towards analysis and other more towards intuition. But I was really surprised that there is actually a third way that a lot of executives and managers use to make a decision. And that is that they just do it. They try it out, they experiment, they pilot. And at first I was quite intrigued about that. Even in very important situations, they were doing that. And what I found out is that they said that I don't have enough information, so I cannot do enough analysis. And I don't have relevant experience. This situation is so novel and so confusing that I don't have an analogy here. I don't have experience. But if I try it out, I'm going to get some more information and I will gain some experience here. So in essence, actually just doing it, action, is a third way of making a decision. So if you find yourself in a situation where you don't have the information or the relevant experience, then there's nothing wrong with trying it out and seeing what goes on. But I think the thinking here is that you are going to learn very, very quickly from that, because there'll probably be a higher risk of failure, but that you're going to, as Meredith said, iterate that particular decision and make it better. Well, this approach, we were talking about in a crisis situation, but I can tell you, we were talking about this before as well. Over the past few years, you've heard of words like agile and design thinking and lean innovation, all of these methodologies are about iterative prototyping and trying things out and learning as you go and failing fast and so on and so forth. So I think it's quite a valid approach to making a decision. Sorry for the long answer, but I think it's an important one because what I talked about in the ACE framework is hypothesis testing. What you're talking about here by just trying it out is hypothesis generation. So I think it's a very, very valid question that was asked.
We still have a few more. I'm going to squeeze this one in. What insight can you provide around the decision-making process when the outcome impacts people over profit? For example, a decision is good for profit, but not for people. Depending on your value system, your intuition and confirmation bias could impact. What part of the process can help with this?
So the executives and managers that I spoke with recently, what I was quite pleasantly surprised with is how much empathy that they were exhibiting, putting people first, even though they know that their organization is suffering and is going to suffer quite a bit. And they were talking about the impact on the health and safety of their people in the short run, as well as the well-being of their people in the long run. So I think that people trump everything else. Now, there are going to be many organizations that are going to put other things before people, and that's going to happen. But it's in these times we're going to see what true leadership is. And afterwards, we're going to write about those people who are going to empathize with their staff and employees and customers more and make decisions based on that. And I think the long-term value will come. Certainly, there is a risk to the organization's well-being in the short run, but eventually, I think that's going to happen. So I think putting people first is absolutely critical.
I think that's a really nice place to end, unless you want to leave us with any kind of final thought about decision-making in this strange time we're all living through. Do you have any final thoughts you want to leave our audience with, Salman?
Yeah, again, what my thought would be that going back to this idea that you have to have some sort of a process. It doesn't have to be perfect, but you have to have some sort of a process. Start with your intuition. You're going to have one, but then make sure you validate it with analysis. And I think that is something that you should always do, whether it's good times or crisis situations like these. So wishing everybody the best going forward. I'm sure if we all stick together, we'll come out of it and have a wonderful future.
Great, thank you very much. So first I want to say thank you to our audience for asking such excellent questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of them, but we did a pretty good job. We got through lots of them. I also, as I always do, want to remind our audience about our Queen's Executive Education offerings. We have lots of management development courses offered through remote learning. Salman, who was just speaking to us so wisely, will have a one-day remote learning course on decision making, which will happen in August. Our execution program starts June the 8th. A well-crafted strategy is great, but in the end, it's your ability to execute that truly moves the needle. So check that program out and on all the rest of them at the URL on your screen, smithqueens.com/execed. We also offer all of our course offerings in customized in-house format for companies. So if your team has time on their hands right now, perhaps this is a good time to think about some kind of specialized training, and we can help with that. I wanted to also let our audience know that we are going to be taking a break next week, and then we'll be back we'll be back on Thursday, May 28th. And from then forward, we will be moving to an every other week delivery model. So Thursday, May 28th at 1 o'clock, we'll be doing a global financial check-in. So as always, sign-up details will be posted on the Smith Business Insight website. You'll be getting an email inviting you to attend. But again, we'll be switching to an every other week model, but we'll be keeping them as fascinating as always. So I do hope that you will continue to join us every other week, starting the week after next. Salman, thank you so much for sharing your insights with us today. You've been really fantastic. I know that there were so many concrete takeaways for the audience. So I know it's always really wonderful when people can leave after an hour feeling like they have something they can implement. So thanks very much for that. you.
Thanks for the opportunity.
So from the Smith School of Business at Queen's University, thank you everyone for tuning in today. As Salman says, I hope you're well and healthy and take care, and we'll see you in a couple of weeks. Thanks. Bye.